My husband Edgar thought he could abandon me in Greece to recouple his romance with his ex-wife Celine, leaving me stranded while they played house in the country I'd spent months planning for us to explore together. What he didn't realize was that I'd accidentally taken his passport home with me, along with access to every single one of our accounts. 3 days later, when he called me in a panic from the airport, begging me to overnight his documents, I smiled and said, "Oh, Edgar, I'm so sorry. I had no idea I'd taken it."
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
Let me tell you exactly how a woman who'd been planning other people's dreams for 15 years finally started planning her own revenge. It started 6 months earlier in our pristine Boston townhouse that I decorated with the same meticulous attention I gave everything else in our marriage. I was sitting at our kitchen island, laptop open, surrounded by travel guides and printed itineraries, planning what I desperately hoped would save our dying relationship. Edgar Porter, my husband of 12 years, walked past me toward the coffee machine without so much as a glance at the colorful brochures spread across the marble countertop. "Greece looks amazing," I said, my voice carrying that forced brightness I'd perfected over the years. "I found this incredible boutique hotel in Santorini for our anniversary. The sunset views are supposed to be breathtaking." Edgar grunted his acknowledgement while scrolling through his phone, his attention already consumed by whatever was more interesting than our marriage. This had become our pattern, me desperately trying to inject romance and connection into our relationship while he drifted further away, content to let me carry the emotional weight of keeping us together. "The ferry schedules are a bit complicated," I continued, pointing to my carefully researched notes, "but I've mapped out the whole month. We'll island hop through the Cyclades, then finish in Athens for the museums you love." "Sounds good, Amelia," he replied absently, never looking up from his screen. "You always figure these things out." Those 5 words, "you always figure these things out," had become the soundtrack of our marriage. Edgar had gradually transferred every responsibility for our life together onto my shoulders. I planned our vacations, managed our social calendar, remembered birthdays and anniversaries, even chose his mother's Christmas gifts. He'd become a passenger in his own life, and I'd become the unpaid coordinator of his happiness. But this trip was going to be different. I'd booked us into romantic restaurants, planned sunset dinners on private terraces, even arranged a couple's photography session on the cliffs of Oia. This month in Greece would remind us why we'd fallen in love in the first place. It had to. The irony wasn't lost on me that I chose Greece, the birthplace of democracy, to try saving a marriage where I'd been doing all the work while Edgar enjoyed all the benefits, without contributing to the relationship's success. 3 weeks before our departure, I was reviewing our hotel confirmations when Edgar finally showed some interest in the trick. "You know," he said, settling beside me on the couch with unusual enthusiasm, "I've actually been thinking about Greece a lot lately." My heart lifted. Finally, he was engaging with our plans. "Really? What aspects interest you most? The history, the architecture, Just the whole vibe of it," he interrupted, but his excitement felt different somehow. Not the warm anticipation I'd hoped for, but something more secretive. "It's going to be refreshing." I should have recognized that tone. Edgar had used it before when he was keeping something from me, but I was so desperate for any sign of enthusiasm that I ignored the warning bells. The month leading up to our departure was a whirlwind of preparation that I handled entirely alone. Edgar's contribution consisted of packing his suitcase the night before and making sure his passport was current. Meanwhile, I coordinated everything: our transportation to Logan Airport, travel insurance, international cell phone plans, currency exchange, restaurant reservations, museum tickets, even downloading Greek language apps to our phones. "I've created a shared folder with all our confirmations," I told him as we sat in the airport departure lounge. "Hotel check-ins, ferry tickets, dinner reservations, everything's organized by date." Edgar nodded, already distracted by his phone again. "Great, you're so good at this stuff." As our plane lifted off from Boston, I pressed my face to the window and watched the city shrink below us. This was it, our chance to reconnect, to remember what we'd been before routine and complacency had eroded our foundation. I'd invested months of planning and thousands of dollars into creating the perfect romantic escape. The 8-hour flight to Athens gave me time to daydream about our month ahead. I imagined us exploring ancient ruins hand in hand, sharing intimate dinners overlooking the Aegean, taking long walks through whitewashed villages while rediscovering each other. Edgar slept for most of the journey, his head resting against the window, while I studied our itinerary one final time. Athens greeted us with golden sunlight and the organized chaos of a city that had been thriving for millennia. Our hotel in the Plaka district was perfectly positioned, walking distance to the Acropolis, surrounded by tavernas and shops, exactly as I'd researched. Edgar seemed more alert as we checked in, his eyes scanning the lobby with an intensity I hadn't seen in months. "This is beautiful, Amelia," he said, and for a moment I felt vindicated. All those hours of research and planning had been worth it. Our first few days unfolded exactly as I hoped. We explored the Acropolis Museum, wandered through the ancient agora, shared meze platters at tiny tavernas tucked into narrow streets.
Edgar was present in a way he hadn't been for years, asking questions about the history, taking photos of us together, even holding my hand as we navigated the crowded markets of Monastiraki. But by our fourth day, something shifted. Edgar announced over breakfast that he wanted to take a solo walk to clear his head and process everything we'd been seeing. I could come with you, I offered, hoping to maintain the connection we'd been rebuilding. No, he said quickly. I think some alone time would be good. You know how I need to decompress when there's a lot of new information. I did know that about Edgar. He'd always been someone who needed solitude to process experiences. But something in his eagerness to be alone felt different this time, less about needing space and more about wanting to escape from me specifically. Of course, I agreed, swallowing my disappointment. I'll explore the National Gardens. We can meet back here for dinner? Actually, Edgar said, avoiding my eyes, I might be out pretty late. Don't wait up. And with that casual dismissal, the foundation of our Greek adventure and our marriage began to crumble beneath my feet. The next morning, Edgar didn't return to our hotel room until nearly 3 a.m. I heard the keycard beeping repeatedly before he finally managed to open the door, stumbling slightly as he made his way to the bathroom. When I stirred and asked if he was all right, he mumbled something about getting lost in the winding streets of Plaka and having more wine than intended at a local taverna. I was worried, I whispered in the darkness, but Edgar was already settling into bed, his back turned toward me. Sorry, he said, but there was no real apology in his voice, just the automatic response of someone going through the motions. I lay awake for another hour, staring at the ceiling while Edgar's breathing deepened into sleep. Something about his story didn't sit right with me. Edgar was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. He had an excellent sense of direction and rarely drank to excess, especially not alone in a foreign country. But I pushed my concerns aside, attributing my suspicions to the insecurity that had been growing in our marriage over the past few years. The following day, Edgar was unusually cheerful at breakfast, almost bouncing in his seat as he planned another solo exploration. I really want to check out the National Archaeological Museum today, he said, his enthusiasm genuine for the first time in months. You mentioned wanting to visit that Byzantine museum, right? We could split up again and compare notes tonight. Part of me wanted to suggest we visit the museums together. Wasn't that the point of a romantic anniversary trip? But Edgar seemed so animated, so much like the man I'd married, that I didn't want to dim his excitement by seeming clingy. That sounds perfect, I agreed, even as a small voice in my head questioned why everything felt better when we were apart. Over the next week, this pattern established itself as our new normal. Edgar would disappear for hours each day, returning to our hotel refreshed and strangely energetic, full of stories about architectural details and historical sites that sounded rehearsed rather than genuinely experienced. Meanwhile, I explored Athens alone, checking items off our carefully planned itinerary while taking photos of myself at locations that were supposed to capture romantic moments between us. I began to document everything obsessively, as if creating evidence of the trip would somehow materialize the relationship I'd hoped for.
My phone filled with selfies at the Acropolis, solo shots at charming cafes, pictures of sunset views that were supposed to be shared experiences. Each image was a small monument to my growing isolation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But Edgar's new energy was infectious, and I found myself caught between concern and relief. This was the most engaged he'd been in years, even if that engagement didn't seem to include me. When he suggested we extend our Athens stay by a few extra days before moving on to the islands, I readily agreed. Anything that kept this version of Edgar around seemed worth preserving. "You're different here," I told him one evening as we shared dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Acropolis. The ancient monument was illuminated against the darkening sky, exactly as romantic as I'd imagined when booking this table months earlier. Edgar paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. "Different how?" "Happier, more like yourself." I reached across the table to touch his hand. I'd forgotten how much I missed this version of you. For a moment, something flickered across Edgar's face, guilt, perhaps, or discomfort. But it passed quickly, replaced by that practiced smile I'd learned to recognize as his deflection mechanism. "Greece is good for the soul," he said, pulling his hand away to reach for his wineglass. "Maybe we should have done this years ago." The irony stung. I'd been suggesting romantic trips for years, only to be told we were too busy, too financially stretched, too settled in our routines. But I swallowed the response, unwilling to puncture this fragile bubble of happiness we'd found. What I didn't realize was that Edgar's transformation had nothing to do with Greece's ancient magic and everything to do with someone from his past who had apparently chosen the same month to rediscover the cradle of Western civilization. Our hotel, the Electra Palace, sat perfectly positioned in the heart of Athens' historic district. I'd chosen it specifically for its proximity to major sites and its reputation for romantic ambiance. The rooftop pool offered stunning views of the Acropolis, and the lobby buzzed with the energy of international travelers beginning their own Greek adventures. It was this prime location that made Edgar's supposed solo wanderings so convenient. While I assumed he was genuinely exploring museums and archaeological sites, he was actually conducting a very different kind of research into his personal history. I should have questioned why he never brought back museum brochures, or why his stories lacked the specific details that usually characterized Edgar's methodical approach to new experiences. I should have wondered why he seemed to know exactly where he was going each morning, despite claiming to be wandering aimlessly through unfamiliar neighborhoods. But I was so grateful to see him animated and present that I ignored every warning sign. I was like a woman dying of thirst who doesn't question the source of water when it finally appears. Our shared dinners became the highlight of my days. Edgar would return from his mysterious explorations energized and talkative, regaling me with observations about Greek culture and history that sounded surprisingly sophisticated for someone who'd shown minimal interest in our destination during months of planning. "Did you know that the concept of hospitality, philoxenia, is sacred here?" he said one evening, his eyes bright with what I mistook for genuine discovery. "It literally means love of strangers, the idea that welcoming outsiders is a moral imperative." I nodded enthusiastically, thrilled to finally be having the kind of deep, cultural conversations I'd envisioned for our trip. What I didn't realize was that Edgar wasn't sharing insights gained from museums or guidebooks, but rather perspectives filtered through someone else's intimate knowledge of her homeland. Someone who had been showing him Greece through very personal eyes while I wandered ancient ruins alone, creating a one-woman photo album of what should have been our shared adventure. The cruel irony was that Edgar was falling in love with Greece, just not with the Greece I was showing him. By our second week in Athens, Edgar's absences had stretched from afternoon wanderings to full-day disappearances. He would leave right after breakfast, claiming he wanted to really dive deep into specific neighborhoods or museums, and wouldn't return until well past dinner time. Each day, his explanations became more elaborate and less believable. I spent the entire afternoon in the Benaki Museum, he told me one evening, his cheeks flushed with what I assumed was sun exposure. You know how I get when I find something that really captures my attention. I completely lost track of time. I nodded, even though the Benaki Museum could be thoroughly explored in 2 hours, and Edgar had supposedly been gone for 9. But questioning him felt like an admission that I didn't trust my own husband, so I continued to smile and express interest in his discoveries, while a cold knot of unease grew in my stomach. The most disturbing change wasn't Edgar's physical absence, it was how present he seemed when he was gone, and how distant he became when he returned. During our morning conversations, he would be animated and affectionate, full of plans and enthusiasm. But as the day wore on and evening approached, he would grow increasingly restless, checking his phone constantly and seeming to mentally prepare for his next escape. I began to feel like I was living with two different men: the charming morning Edgar who seemed genuinely happy to see me, and the evening Edgar who could barely contain his impatience to be somewhere else. Maybe tomorrow we could explore together, I suggested one morning as Edgar prepared for another solo adventure. I'd love to see the National Gardens through your eyes. Oh, you know what? I was actually planning to head to Piraeus tomorrow, Edgar said quickly, his tone casual but his body language tense. Check out the marina, maybe take some photos of the boats. Probably pretty boring for you. It was a reasonable excuse, except that Edgar had never shown any interest in boats or marinas in the 12 years I'd known him. But I forced myself to smile and nod, adding another small lie to the growing collection I was pretending not to notice. The phone calls started during our 3rd week. Edgar's cell would ring at odd hours, during dinner, in the middle of conversations, even early in the morning when we were both still in bed. He would glance at the screen with an expression I couldn't quite read before declining the call and offering a vague explanation about work or spam. Everything okay? I asked after the 4th mysterious call in 2 days. Just some project follow-ups from Boston, Edgar replied, but his hands were shaking slightly as he put the phone face down on the restaurant table. You know how clients can be, even when you're on vacation. I did know how Edgar's architectural clients could be, which was exactly why this explanation made no sense. His projects were meticulously planned months in advance, and he'd never had a client who would call repeatedly during a clearly scheduled vacation. Edgar was too professional to leave loose ends that would require emergency consultations from halfway around the world. But more than the lies themselves, it was Edgar's delivery that unsettled me. He'd always been a terrible liar. His left eye would twitch, and he'd speak slightly faster than normal. These new deceptions flowed smoothly, practiced, as if he'd been rehearsing them. I started paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. Edgar's clothes smelled different when he returned each evening, not just like Athens streets and tourist sites, but like an unfamiliar perfume that was definitely floral and definitely not mine. His stories about museums and archaeological sites lacked the specific details that usually characterized Edgar's methodical approach to new experiences. One evening, I decided to test my growing suspicions. How was the Byzantine Museum today? I asked, knowing full well that Edgar had claimed to be visiting the Acropolis Museum. Incredible, Edgar replied without missing a beat. The iconography was just breathtaking, really makes you think about the intersection of art and spirituality. My heart sank. Either Edgar had genuinely confused which museum he'd visited, or he was lying so casually that he couldn't even keep his cover story straight. Neither option offered much comfort for our marriage. I began documenting Edgar's absences in my travel journal, initially telling myself it was just to keep track of our itinerary. But as the list grew longer, I realized I was actually building a case file of his deception. 9 hours at a 2-hour museum, 6 hours exploring a neighborhood that could be walked end to end in 40 minutes, an entire afternoon getting lost in an area where Edgar had supposedly spent the previous day and should have been familiar with. The breaking point came during our 4th week, when Edgar announced he would be spending an entire day in Glyfada, a coastal suburb of Athens. I want to see how modern Greeks live outside the tourist areas, he explained, his enthusiasm seemingly genuine, Really get a feel for contemporary culture. That sounds fascinating, I replied. I'd love to come with you. I've been reading about how young Athenians are revitalizing the suburbs. Edgar's face fell for just a moment before he recovered. You know what? I think this might be one of those experiences where a solo perspective would be more authentic. Sometimes having two tourists together changes how locals interact with you. It was such an obviously manufactured excuse that I felt something crack inside my chest. Edgar wasn't just avoiding shared experiences, he was actively working to ensure we remained separated. That night, I stood on our hotel room balcony, looking out over the Acropolis while Edgar showered. The ancient monument was illuminated against the dark sky, exactly as beautiful as I'd imagined when planning this trip. But instead of sharing this moment with my husband, I was alone, wondering when our marriage had become something Edgar needed a vacation from. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through the photos I'd taken over the past 3 weeks. Hundreds of images of Athens, but almost none of Edgar and me together. I'd been so focused on documenting the places we'd visited that I hadn't noticed we'd stopped creating memories together. When Edgar emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around his waist, I turned to face him with a question I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Edgar, are you happy here? With me, I mean." He froze, water droplets still beating on his shoulders. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the hotel room that was supposed to have been our romantic sanctuary. "Of course I'm happy," he finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you've been running away from me every single day," I thought. "Because you lie about where you've been and seem relieved when you can escape our conversations. Because I feel more alone in your presence than I do wandering ancient ruins by myself." But instead, I just smiled and said, "No reason, just checking in." That night, Edgar fell asleep easily while I lay awake, listening to him breathe, wondering if the man beside me was still my husband or just someone wearing his face. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning in our 4th week, during what should have been another ordinary day of Edgar's mysterious disappearances. I had planned to visit the National Gallery while he pursued whatever secret agenda had been consuming his days. But as I stood in the hotel lobby waiting for my taxi, I realized I'd forgotten my camera in our room. Racing back upstairs, I used my keycard to slip quietly into our suite, not wanting to disturb Edgar if he was still getting ready for his day. Instead, I found him on our balcony, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a voice so tender and intimate that I froze in the doorway. "I can't wait to see you again," he was saying, his back turned to me as he gazed out over the Athens skyline. "Last night was incredible. I keep thinking about what you said at dinner, about showing me the real Greece." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. Edgar had told me he'd spent the previous evening alone, walking through Plaka and thinking about our relationship. He'd returned to our room at nearly midnight, claiming exhaustion from hours of solitary reflection. I know," Edgar continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried clearly in the morning air. "She's starting to ask questions, but it's only a few more days before we move to Santorini, and then everything will be different." I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain Edgar would hear it. He was talking about another woman, and whatever was happening between them was significant enough that they were making plans around my presence. "Celine," Edgar began, but then caught himself as my sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. Celine. The name hit me like a physical blow. Edgar's ex-wife, the woman he'd dated before me, the relationship that had ended when she moved back to Greece to care for her Beijing parents nearly 15 years ago. I'd always known she was from Athens, but Edgar had assured me that chapter of his life was completely closed. Edgar spun around, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and finally resignation, as our eyes met across the hotel room. He ended the call without saying goodbye. "Amelia," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I thought you'd already left for the museum." Clearly. I stepped fully into the room, my legs unsteady beneath me. Celine Lintz, your ex-wife who just happened to be in Athens during our anniversary trip. Edgar set his phone down on the balcony table with deliberate care, like a man buying time to construct his defense. It's not what you think. Really? Because what I think is that you've been sneaking around with your ex-wife for 3 weeks while I've been exploring our anniversary destination alone. My voice was remarkably steady, considering that my entire world was crumbling around me. What I think is that every museum visit, every solo walk, every late-night return has been a lie. We just ran into each other, Edgar said, stepping into the room but maintaining distance between us. It was completely coincidental. She was having coffee at that little place near the Acropolis, and I recognized her voice before I even saw her face. When? I demanded. When did this coincidental reunion happen? Edgar's jaw tightened. The first day I went out alone. 4 weeks ago. He'd been seeing her for 4 weeks, which meant that every single moment of enthusiasm, every spark of energy I'd attributed to Greece's romantic influence had actually been the result of reconnecting with another woman. And you didn't think to mention this to your wife? I laughed, but the sound came out sharp and bitter. Your ex-wife just happened to be in Athens during our anniversary trip, and that didn't seem like information worth sharing? I didn't want to upset you, Edgar said, but his tone suggested he knew how pathetic that excuse sounded. I knew you'd react exactly like this. React like what? Like a woman who discovers her husband has been lying to her face for a month? Like someone who realizes the man she's been married to for 12 years has been conducting a secret affair during what was supposed to be our romantic reunion? It's not an affair, Edgar protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We're just talking, catching up on old times. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through the photos I'd taken over the past month. Endless solo shots at romantic locations, selfies at restaurants where I'd eaten alone, pictures of sunsets I'd watched by myself while Edgar was supposedly exploring museums. Catching up, I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call dinner dates and intimate phone conversations about showing you the real Greece? Edgar's face flushed red. You were listening to my private conversation. In our shared hotel room, during our anniversary trip, while you were making plans with another woman? I felt something shift inside me, like a lock clicking open. Tell me, Edgar, exactly how much of our month in Greece has been real? Any of it? For a moment, Edgar looked like he might try to continue the charade, but something in my expression, perhaps the complete absence of the desperate hope that had characterized my recent attempts to save our marriage, seemed to deflate his defenses. Celine knows Athens like a local, he said quietly. She's been showing me places tourists never see, restaurants in neighborhoods you won't find in guidebooks, art galleries run by her friends. It's a completely different experience than following an itinerary. The casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. The itinerary I spent months researching, the romantic locations I chose specifically for us, the restaurants I booked to celebrate our anniversary. I didn't plan for this to happen, Edgar said, but there was no apology in his voice. Seeing her again just reminded me of who I used to be, before responsibility, and he gestured vaguely in my direction. Before me, I finished for him. You're saying that reconnecting with your ex-wife reminded you of who you were before you married me? Edgar's silence was answer enough. I walked to the balcony and looked out over the city that was supposed to have brought us back together. Instead, it had revealed the truth about our marriage, that Edgar had been sleepwalking through our life together, waiting for something or someone to wake him up. How long are you planning to keep this up? I asked, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. Keep what up? I turned to face him, this man I'd loved for 12 years, who now felt like a stranger. The pretense that we're still married, that this trip means anything, that you have any intention of coming home to Boston with me? Edgar's expression confirmed what I already knew. Whatever was happening with Celine had already progressed far beyond casual reminiscing. They were rebuilding something I'd never even realized was still there. "I need some time to figure things out," Edgar said finally. "No," I replied, feeling something powerful and unfamiliar rising in my chest. The fragile politeness that had been holding our conversation together shattered the moment Edgar asked for time to figure things out. Something inside me snapped, not into hysteria or tears, but into a crystalline clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Time to figure things out," I repeated, tasting each word. "You mean time to decide whether you want to continue your affair with Celine or pretend to recommit to our marriage?" Edgar flinched at the word affair, but didn't deny it. "It's more complicated than that, Amelia. You don't understand what it's like to feel alive again after years of just existing." Existing? The word hit me like a slap. Is that what our marriage has been to you? Existing? That's not what I meant. "No, I think that's exactly what you meant." I moved away from the balcony, needing distance from him and the view of the city. Tell me, Edgar, when exactly did I become the thing you needed to escape from? When did the woman who planned every detail of your comfort become the burden you needed Celine to save you from?
Edgar's jaw tightened. "You want to do this? Fine, let's do this. You plan everything, Amelia. Every vacation, every dinner party, every weekend activity. You've turned our marriage into one of your projects, complete with schedules and itineraries and carefully coordinated outcomes." The accusation was so twisted, so completely divorced from reality that I almost laughed. "I plan things because you stopped participating. I coordinate our life because you checked out years ago. I create structure because the alternative is nothing. Maybe nothing would be better than being managed like a child," Edgar shot back, his voice rising. "Do you know what it's like to live with someone who has already decided how everything should go? Who books restaurants without asking what I might want to eat? Who plans vacations based on what she thinks I should enjoy? I plan things you tell me you like." I was shouting now, months of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. "Every restaurant, every museum, every activity, I research what interests you, what fits your preferences, what makes you happy. I've spent 12 years trying to create a life you'd want to live." "That's the problem," Edgar said, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "You've been creating the life you think I should want instead of asking what I actually need. And what you actually need is your ex-wife." Edgar's silence stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his words were carefully chosen and devastating. "Celine doesn't try to improve me. She doesn't have opinions about how I should spend my time, or what experiences would be good for me. She just lets me be myself. The self you were 15 years ago, before you had any real responsibilities, before you built a career, a home, a marriage." I could hear my voice getting higher, more desperate, but I couldn't stop myself. "You want to cosplay your college self with the woman who knew you when you had no obligations to anyone but yourself? At least she doesn't make me feel guilty for wanting spontaneity in my life." "Guilty? Edgar, I've been begging you for years to be more spontaneous. I've suggested surprise weekends, unplanned dinners, random adventures. You're the one who always wants to know the details, who needs everything scheduled and confirmed in advance." But even as I said it, I realized the horrible truth. Edgar did want spontaneity, just not with me. With me he wanted the security of my planning, and the comfort of my coordination. With Celine, he wanted the thrill of unpredictability, and the excitement of rediscovering himself. "This is exactly why I didn't tell you about running into her," Edgar said, his tone shifting to condescension. "I knew you'd turn it into some referendum on our entire marriage, instead of just accepting that sometimes people reconnect with their past." "Reconnect?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You've been having a month-long affair during our anniversary trip, and you're calling it reconnecting. Nothing physical has happened," Edgar said quickly, but the defensiveness in his voice suggested that was a technicality rather than the truth. "Oh, well then I suppose I should be grateful that you're only emotionally cheating on me in the country I planned for us to fall in love with all over again." Edgar's face hardened. "You know what, Amelia? Maybe that's the real problem. You planned for us to fall in love again. You scheduled romance like it was a business meeting. You created an itinerary for intimacy, because the alternative was watching our marriage die from your complete lack of effort. I was screaming now, all pretense of control abandoned. I've been the only person fighting for us for years while you've been sleepwalking through our life together. Maybe I was sleepwalking because there was nothing worth waking up for, Edgar said, and with those words he crossed a line we couldn't come back from. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a bomb explodes, when the world reorganizes itself around a new reality. We stared at each other across our hotel room, this beautiful romantic space I'd chosen to save our marriage, and I saw my future with absolute clarity. "Get out," I said quietly. "Amelia, get out of this room. Go to Celine. Go live your authentic, unplanned, spontaneous life with someone who doesn't burden you with love or commitment, or the expectation that marriage means showing up for each other." Edgar grabbed his wallet and phone, pausing at the door. "I'll be back tonight so we can discuss this rationally." "No," I said, feeling something powerful crystallizing in my chest. "You really won't." The door clicked shut behind Edgar with a finality that seemed to echo through the suddenly cavernous hotel room. I stood frozen in the middle of our suite, surrounded by the remnants of what I'd believed was our romantic reunion, my carefully researched guidebooks scattered across the coffee table, restaurant confirmation emails still pulled up on my laptop, his clothes hanging in the closet next to mine as if we were still a couple with a shared future. For the first time in weeks, silence settled over me completely. No more pretending Edgar's absences were normal. No more manufacturing enthusiasm for solo explorations that were supposed to be shared experiences. No more lying to myself about the growing distance between us, or making excuses for his obvious deception. The truth sat in my chest like a stone. My husband had been conducting an affair for our entire anniversary trip, using my meticulously planned romantic getaway as cover for rekindling his relationship with another woman. Every museum he'd claimed to visit alone, every neighborhood he'd supposedly explored, every late return explained away by his need for solitude, all of it had been time spent with Celine.
I walked to the balcony and looked out over Athens, this ancient city that was supposed to have been the backdrop for our renewed commitment to each other. Instead, it had become the setting for the final destruction of our marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were in the birthplace of democracy while Edgar had been making unilateral decisions about our future without giving me a voice in the process. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, my heart leaped with the possibility that Edgar was already regretting his words, ready to fight for us instead of running away. But the message was from our hotel concierge, confirming tomorrow's dinner reservation at a rooftop restaurant I'd booked months ago for what was supposed to be our final romantic evening in Athens before moving on to Santorini. The reminder hit me like a physical blow. Tomorrow, we were scheduled to take the ferry to the islands, where I'd planned the most romantic portion of our trip. Sunset dinners on cliffside terraces, couples photography sessions, intimate hotel suites with infinity pools overlooking the Aegean Sea. All of it designed to remind us why we'd fallen in love, to give us memories that would sustain us through whatever challenges waited back home. Instead, Edgar would probably be making plans to extend his Athens stay with Celine, while I sat alone on ferry decks, surrounded by honeymooning couples and families creating the kinds of memories I'd been desperately trying to manufacture for us. I opened my laptop and began scrolling through our carefully planned itinerary, seeing it now through the lens of Edgar's betrayal. Every romantic restaurant became a reminder of my naivete. Every couple's activity highlighted how thoroughly I'd been abandoned. Every sunset viewing spot represented another evening I'd spend alone, while my husband explored his authentic connection with another woman. The worst part wasn't even Edgar's affair. It was his complete dismissal of my efforts to save our marriage. He'd transformed my love into a burden, my care into control, my desire for connection into manipulation. In his narrative, I wasn't a wife fighting for her marriage. I was a manager trying to control his experience of life itself. But as I sat in that hotel room, surrounded by the evidence of my months of planning and Edgar's weeks of deception, something unexpected began to replace my devastation. It started as a small flicker of anger, growing steadily into something much more powerful: clarity. Edgar was right about one thing. I had been managing his life. I'd been planning his happiness, coordinating his comfort, and organizing his experiences, because he'd gradually opted out of participating in our partnership. But instead of appreciating my efforts or communicating his dissatisfaction, he'd simply taken advantage of my work while secretly resenting me for doing it. More importantly, while I'd been fighting to save our marriage, Edgar had been auditioning for a new relationship. He'd used our anniversary trip as an extended date with his ex-wife, comparing my carefully planned romance with Celine's spontaneous local knowledge. I'd been competing in a contest I didn't even know was happening, against a woman who held the advantage of Edgar's nostalgia and his fantasy of who he might have been if he'd made different choices. I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my camera roll, looking at the hundreds of photos I'd taken over the past month. Solo shots at the Acropolis, selfies at romantic restaurants, pictures of sunset views that should have been shared experiences. Each image told the story of a woman trying desperately to document a relationship that had already ended. But buried among those photos was something Edgar didn't know about, something that would shift the power dynamic in ways he couldn't imagine. Because while I'd been dutifully managing our travel logistics, I'd also been managing something much more significant: our finances, our travel documents, and our ability to navigate the world as a couple. Edgar had always been content to let me handle the practical details of our life together. What he didn't realize was that those practical details included some very important documents that would soon become the foundation of my freedom rather than the tools of his comfort. As I began to form a plan, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about my own future. Edgar wanted spontaneity and authenticity. He was about to get more of both than he'd bargained for. But first, I had some very careful planning to do. After Edgar left, I sat on our hotel bed for nearly an hour, staring at the wall while my mind slowly processed the magnitude of what had just happened. The silence felt different now, not the uncomfortable quiet of a failing marriage, but the profound stillness that follows a detonation. Everything I believed about our relationship, our trip, our future had been obliterated in a single conversation. I began taking inventory of my situation with the methodical approach that Edgar had always mocked as overplanning. My phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from friends back home, people who'd been following our romantic Greek adventure through my carefully curated social media posts. How was I supposed to explain that our anniversary trip had been a month-long cover story for my husband's affair? But as I scrolled through my contacts, something occurred to me that hadn't fully registered during our confrontation. I was the one who had organized every aspect of our travel. I was the one with all the confirmation numbers, account passwords, and booking references saved in my phone. I was the primary cardholder on our joint credit cards, the one whose name was on our travel insurance, the one who had coordinated with our bank about international transactions. More importantly, I was the one carrying both of our passports in my travel organizer, a leather portfolio I'd bought specifically to keep all our important documents secure during the trip. Edgar had handed them to me at Logan Airport with his typical casual dismissal: "You're so much better at keeping track of this stuff." I opened a portfolio and stared at the 2 burgundy booklets that represented our ability to travel freely through Europe. Edgar's passport photo looked back at me, his confident smile frozen in that moment before our world fell apart. Without this document, he was essentially trapped in Greece, unable to board any international flight or cross any border. The realization sent a shock of possibility through my system. For the first time in our marriage, I held actual power over Edgar's circumstances rather than just responsibility for managing them. I pulled out my laptop and began examining our financial arrangements with new eyes. Every credit card account showed me as the primary holder, with Edgar listed as an authorized user. Our joint checking account, where I deposited the cash for our month-long trip, had my name first on all documentation. Even our travel insurance policy listed me as the primary contact and decision-maker. Edgar had been so content to let me handle the boring details of our life that he'd essentially made me the gatekeeper of our shared resources. While he'd been playing house with Celine, I'd been maintaining the infrastructure that made his carefree exploration possible. But there was something else, something that made my situation even more interesting. 3 days ago, I transferred a significant amount of money from our savings account to checking to cover our remaining expenses in Greece and our planned week in Santorini. Nearly $8,000 sat in an account that only I could access, money that was supposed to fund the romantic conclusion of our anniversary trip. I opened my banking app and stared at the numbers on my screen. Edgar had no cash beyond what he might have in his wallet, no access to our accounts without going through me, and no way to leave the country without the passport currently sitting in my travel organizer. For 12 years, I'd been the invisible infrastructure of Edgar's comfort. I'd managed his schedule, coordinated his travel, maintained his social calendar, and organized his domestic life so thoroughly that he'd forgotten how much work it actually required. Now, stripped of my support system, he was about to discover exactly how much he'd been taking for granted. My phone rang, jarring me from my calculations. Edgar's name appeared on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again, and again. After the 5th call, I finally answered. "Amelia, we need to talk." Edgar's voice was strained, less confident than it had been during our confrontation. "I've been thinking about what happened, and I realize we both said things in anger." "Where are you?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. I'm with Celine, but that's not important right now. What's important is that we find a way to work through this like adults." The casual admission that he'd run straight to his ex-wife after our fight crystallized something in my mind. This wasn't a marriage crisis that could be resolved through communication and compromise. This was Edgar testing whether he could have both relationships simultaneously, his stable, organized life with me, and his exciting, nostalgic adventure with Celine. "You're right," I said. "We should definitely handle this like adults." "Good. I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. Look, I know this situation is complicated, but—" "Edgar," I interrupted, "do you have your passport with you?" There was a pause. "What?" "Your passport. Do you have it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Why are you asking about my passport?" "Because I have it, along with mine. They're both in my travel organizer, where they've been since we left Boston." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. "Amelia," Edgar said finally, his voice careful and controlled, "I need you to bring me my passport." "Do you?" I asked, "because it seems like you're pretty settled where you are." "This isn't a game. I have rights to my own documents." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "You do have rights to your passport, just like I have rights to expect fidelity during our anniversary trip." "Amelia, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." I smiled for the first time in hours. "Oh, Edgar, I think you've already taken care of making things complicated. I'm just finally learning to appreciate the situation for what it really is." After ending the call with Edgar, I sat in the hotel room feeling a rush of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in our marriage, I wasn't scrambling to fix a problem or smooth over a conflict. Instead, I was in complete control of the situation, and Edgar was the one left scrambling. I opened my laptop and began systematically reviewing every aspect of our financial and travel arrangements, this time not as Edgar's helpful coordinator, but as a woman taking inventory of her own resources. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Our joint checking account contained $7,847 I'd transferred for the trip. Our credit cards were all in my name, with Edgar as an authorized user, an arrangement we'd made years ago for easier management of our finances. Our travel insurance policy listed me as the primary contact for all emergencies, including medical evacuations and trip cancellations. But most importantly, I discovered something I'd completely forgotten about in the chaos of planning our month-long trip. 3 weeks before we left Boston, I'd opened a separate travel account with our bank specifically for international transactions, moving money there to avoid foreign transaction fees. Edgar didn't even know this account existed. It was one of those practical details he'd been happy to let me handle without involvement. The account contained $4,200, money I'd set aside for emergencies or unexpected expenses during our travels. Edgar had no access to it, no knowledge of it, and no legal claim to it, since it was opened in my name alone using funds from my personal savings. I pulled out my phone and began making calls, starting with our hotel's front desk. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Porter," the desk clerk said warmly. "How can I assist you today?" "I need to make some changes to our reservation," I said. "My husband has decided to extend his stay in Athens while I continue with our original travel plans. I'd like to cancel his portion of our Santorini booking and modify my reservation to a single occupancy." "Of course. And will Mr. Porter be remaining in Athens, or should we arrange alternative accommodations for him?" I paused, considering the delicious irony of the question. That will be Mr. Porter's responsibility to arrange. I'm no longer coordinating his travel plans. Next, I called our airline to modify our return flights to Boston. Edgar's ticket was changeable, but would incur substantial fees that would need to be paid by whoever was making the changes. Since all our bookings were in my name and linked to accounts Edgar couldn't access, any modifications to his travel would require his own credit card and his own coordination. "I'd like to change my return flight from Athens to Boston," I told the airline representative, "but I need to cancel my husband's ticket entirely. He's decided to remain in Greece indefinitely." "I can help you with your ticket change, Mrs. Porter, but for your husband's cancellation, he'll need to call us directly or provide written authorization." Perfect. Edgar could deal with the airline bureaucracy himself, something I'd been shielding him from for years. My most important call was to our bank's International Services Department. "I need to report a potential security issue with our joint account," I explained to the representative. "My husband's behavior has become erratic during our travels, and I'm concerned about unauthorized transactions." This wasn't entirely a lie. Edgar's month-long deception and secret affair certainly qualified as erratic behavior, and any expenses related to his relationship with Celine would definitely be unauthorized as far as I was concerned. "We can place a temporary hold on the account, requiring both signatures for any transactions over $500, the representative offered. This would prevent either party from making large withdrawals or purchases without the other's explicit consent." "That would be perfect," I said, feeling a surge of satisfaction. Edgar could buy coffee and meals, but any significant expenses, like extending his Athens hotel stay or booking flights to follow Celine wherever she might lead him, would require my permission. As I completed each call, I felt myself transforming from Edgar's abandoned wife into something much more powerful, a woman taking control of her own narrative. Every practical detail I'd managed during our marriage, every financial account I'd organized, every travel arrangement I'd coordinated was now serving my interests instead of his comfort. I began drafting an email to Edgar, choosing my words carefully. "Edgar, after our conversation today, I've taken some time to consider our situation objectively. You're right that our marriage has become more about managing logistics than experiencing genuine connection. I've decided to stop managing your logistics entirely, effective immediately. I've modified our travel arrangements to reflect your desire to remain in Athens. Our joint accounts now require both signatures for major transactions. Your return flight to Boston has been canceled. I'll be continuing to Santorini tomorrow as originally planned. Your passport is safely stored with our other travel documents. When you're ready to discuss the legal dissolution of our marriage, I'll be happy to arrange for its return through appropriate channels. I hope you find the spontaneity and authenticity you've been seeking, Amelia." I reread the message 3 times before sending it, admiring its cool professionalism. No tears, no begging, no emotional manipulation, just the practical consequences of Edgar's choices delivered with the same efficiency I'd always applied to managing his comfort. My phone rang within minutes of sending the email. Edgar's name flashed on the screen, but I declined the call and turned off my phone entirely. For the first time in our marriage, Edgar's crisis would not become my emergency to solve. Instead, I ordered room service, opened a bottle of wine, and began planning my solo trip to Santorini with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd once lavished on our shared adventures. The difference was that this time I was planning for my own happiness rather than trying to manufacture someone else's. Tomorrow, I would board that ferry alone, but for the first time in years, I was genuinely excited about the journey ahead. The ferry to Santorini took 5 hours, giving me plenty of time to systematically dismantle the infrastructure of Edgar's comfortable life. Sitting on the deck with the Aegean stretching endlessly before me, I made a series of phone calls that would reshape our shared existence from thousands of miles away. My first call was to Elena Dillon, our real estate agent in Boston. Edgar didn't know that I'd been considering downsizing our townhouse for months, researching the market value and exploring smaller properties that would better suit an empty nest couple. What had once been theoretical planning was about to become very practical. Elena, it's Amelia Porter. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Amelia, how's Greece? Edgar posted that sunset photo from your balcony yesterday. Absolutely gorgeous. I paused, realizing that Edgar had been curating his own social media narrative about our trip, probably featuring moments stolen from his time with Celine, while carefully omitting any evidence of his affair. Greece has been illuminating. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I need to discuss putting our property on the market. Oh, are you thinking of relocating? I know Edgar's always talked about wanting something with more outdoor space. Edgar's priorities have shifted recently, I said carefully. I'll be handling the sale myself. Could you prepare a market analysis for our townhouse? I'd like to move quickly. Elena's professional instincts kicked in despite her obvious curiosity about the sudden change. Of course. Are you looking at a particular timeline? As soon as possible. I'll be back in Boston next week and would like to have everything ready to list immediately. My next call was to our accountant, Harrison Billett. As someone who'd been managing our joint finances for years, Harrison would need to understand the new reality before Edgar tried to involve him in any damage control. Harrison, I need to discuss some changes to our financial arrangements. Edgar and I are separating, and I want to ensure all our accounts are properly protected during the transition. I'm sorry to hear that, Amelia. Have you consulted with a divorce attorney yet? Not yet, but that's my next step. For now, I need to understand exactly what assets are in my name versus our joint holdings. Harrison's detailed explanation was more favorable than I'd expected. Our townhouse was inherited from my grandmother and had never been transferred to joint ownership, despite Edgar's periodic suggestions that we simplify the paperwork. My retirement accounts remained separate, as did several investment funds I'd maintained independently. The joint accounts represented only a fraction of our total assets, and as primary holders, I had significant control over their management. What about Edgar's business? I asked. Edgar's architectural consulting firm had grown substantially during our marriage, largely due to his ability to take on travel-intensive projects while I managed our domestic responsibilities. His business is a sole proprietorship with some interesting dependencies, Harrison explained. His primary client contracts include clauses about project continuity. If he's unable to meet deadlines or attend required meetings due to personal circumstances, several of his major contracts could be in jeopardy. I made careful notes, understanding that Edgar's month-long disappearance in Greece might have more consequences than he'd anticipated. His biggest client, the Morrison Resort Group, had been expecting design presentations next week for their new Napa Valley property. Edgar couldn't attend virtual meetings or access his computer files if he was stranded in Athens without his passport. My third call was to Jared Lintz, the divorce attorney who'd handled my college roommate's separation 2 years earlier. I'd watched Kendall navigate her divorce with grace and strategic thinking, emerging financially secure and emotionally intact. If I was going to dissolve my marriage, I wanted to do it with the same level of competence I'd applied to every other major decision in my life. I need to discuss filing for divorce, I told Jared after explaining my situation. My husband is currently in Greece, apparently pursuing a relationship with his ex-wife. I have his passport and primary access to our financial accounts. Jared's chuckle was warm but professional. That's certainly a unique starting position. Most of my clients feel powerless at the beginning of divorce proceedings. You seem to be approaching this from a position of strength. I've spent 12 years managing every practical aspect of our life together. I'm just applying those same organizational skills to managing our separation. Smart approach. In terms of documentation, you'll want to preserve evidence of his infidelity and abandonment. Text messages, social media posts, any witnesses who can verify his behavior during your trip. I thought about the hotel staff who'd witnessed Edgar's panic when denied access to our room, the restaurant reservations he'd missed while conducting his affair, the easily verifiable timeline of his deception throughout our anniversary trip. Documentation won't be a problem, I assured him. As the ferry approached Santorino's dramatic cliffs, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. While Edgar was presumably explaining to Celine why he couldn't contribute to dinner expenses or book them a hotel room, I was systematically securing my own future. My phone buzzed with increasingly frantic text messages from Edgar, but I was in no hurry to respond. For 12 years, every crisis in his life had become my emergency to solve. This time, Edgar could experience the full weight of consequences he'd created entirely through his own choices. The afternoon sun painted Santorino's white buildings bold as our ferry docked. I gathered my single suitcase and walked down the gangplank into my new life, leaving Edgar to navigate his authentic, unplanned adventure without any assistance from his former coordinator. For once, I was the one moving forward while he remained stranded by his own decisions.
Santorini welcomed me with the kind of breathtaking beauty I'd only seen in travel magazines. The taxi wound up narrow roads carved into volcanic cliffs, past whitewashed buildings that seemed to defy gravity as they clung to the island's dramatic edges. I'd booked us a suite at the Canaves Oia Hotel, complete with a private infinity pool and unobstructed sunset views over the caldera. What was supposed to be our romantic finale had become my solo retreat. The hotel manager, a sophisticated woman named Maria, greeted me with practiced discretion when I explained that my reservation had changed from a couple to a single guest. "Sometimes the most beautiful journeys are the ones we take alone," she said with a knowing smile, upgrading me to a larger suite without my asking. That first evening in Santorini, I sat on my private terrace with a bottle of Acertico wine, watching the sun sink into the Aegean while my phone buzzed relentlessly with Edgar's increasingly desperate messages. I read them with detached interest, as if observing someone else's crisis unfold in real time. "Amelia, this has gone far enough. I need my passport today. The American embassy says they can issue an emergency passport, but it takes 5-7 business days. Is that really what you want? Celine thinks you're being incredibly petty. This isn't like you." That last message made me laugh out loud. Celine, who'd been conducting an affair with my husband for a month, had opinions about my character. I poured another glass of wine and composed my first response in 2 days. "Edgar, I'm sure Celine has many insights about appropriate behavior in marriages. Please give her my regards." Over the following days I established a peaceful routine that felt revolutionary after years of constant coordination and planning. I woke when I wanted, ate when I was hungry, explored the island at my own pace without consulting anyone else's preferences or schedule. For the first time in our marriage, I was experiencing pure spontaneity, the very thing Edgar claimed to want but had never pursued when it was available to him. Meanwhile, Edgar's situation in Athens was deteriorating in ways that provided a steady stream of entertainment. His messages revealed a man slowly discovering how much infrastructure he'd lost when he lost me. "The hotel wants payment for extending my stay, but our joint account is frozen for large transactions. I can't access my work files without my laptop, which is in our Boston house. Morrison Resort is asking about the Napa project presentations. I need to get home. Celine doesn't have enough room in her apartment for long-term guests." Each message painted a clearer picture of Edgar's diminishing options. Without access to significant funds, he couldn't maintain the comfortable lifestyle he'd taken for granted. Without his passport, he couldn't travel freely or conduct international business. Without my coordination, every practical challenge became his personal crisis to solve. But the most revealing messages came from Edgar's growing frustration with Celine herself. The romantic reunion that had seemed so compelling during stolen afternoons was apparently less appealing when it became a daily reality with practical complications. "Celine works full-time and can't help me navigate Greek bureaucracy during business hours. She's frustrated that I can't contribute equally to expenses right now. She keeps asking when I'm going to figure out my situation with you." I could read between the lines. Celine had been happy to be Edgar's exciting escape from his mundane marriage, but she had no interest in becoming his primary support system. The spontaneous, authentic relationship Edgar had fantasized about was colliding with the reality that all relationships require work, communication, and mutual responsibility. On my 4th day in Santorini, I received a call from Harrison Billett with news that accelerated Edgar's professional crisis. "Amelia, I've been contacted by Morrison Resort Group. They're concerned about Edgar's absence from their scheduled meetings and his lack of communication about project timelines. What kind of concerned? I asked, though I suspected I knew where this was heading. Contract-breaking concerned. Edgar's agreement includes specific clauses about professional availability and project delivery schedules. If he can't meet next week's presentation deadlines, they're within their rights to terminate the contract and seek compensation for delays. The Morrison contract represented nearly 40% of Edgar's annual income. Losing it would create a financial crisis that extended far beyond his current travel difficulties. They've asked me to contact him directly, but his phone seems to be going straight to voicemail, Harrison continued. Do you know how they can reach him? Edgar is in Athens, staying with friends, I said truthfully. I'm sure he'll contact you when he's ready to discuss business matters. That evening, I received the longest message Edgar had sent since our confrontation. Amelia, I know I've made mistakes, but this situation is affecting more than just us. My work is suffering, and I could lose major contracts. Please, can we talk about this like adults? I need to come home so we can work things out properly. I read his message twice, noting how quickly Edgar's tone had shifted from entitled demands to desperate negotiation. The man who'd dismissed our marriage as mundane routine was now begging to return to the stability he'd rejected. But what Edgar didn't understand was that I was no longer interested in being his solution to problems he'd created. For the first time in our relationship, he was experiencing the full consequences of his choices without me rushing to minimize his discomfort.
I set my phone aside and watched another perfect Santorini sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Tomorrow, Edgar would wake up to day 6 of his authentic, unplanned adventure. I was beginning to enjoy mine more each day. My week in Santorini was drawing to a close when Edgar's messages took on a new tone of urgency mixed with something I'd rarely heard from him: genuine panic. His romantic Greek adventure had apparently devolved into a bureaucratic nightmare that even Celine's local knowledge couldn't solve. Amelia, I'm at the American Embassy. They need documentation that I don't have access to without you. Please call me. The embassy requires proof of my identity beyond just my driver's license. They want bank statements or credit card records that are all linked to accounts you've frozen. Celine is losing patience with this situation. She never signed up to house a stranded American indefinitely. That last message contained more truth than Edgar probably intended. The exciting affair he'd been conducting in secret was losing its appeal now that it involved actual responsibility. Celine had fallen in love with the Edgar who showed up for romantic dinners and spontaneous adventures, not the Edgar who needed help navigating immigration bureaucracy and couldn't contribute to shared expenses. I was packing for my return flight to Boston when my phone rang with an international number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I answered. Amelia, this is Celine Lintz. The voice was cultured, confident, with just a trace of Greek accent underlying her perfect English. Hello, Celine, I said, settling into the chair on my hotel balcony. I wasn't expecting to hear from you directly. I think we need to have a conversation, woman to woman. This situation has become complicated. I almost laughed at her delicate phrasing. Has it? From my perspective, things have actually become quite simple. Edgar tells me you've taken his passport and frozen his access to money. Surely you can see how this looks to an outsider. Actually, I'm curious how it looks to you, I said, genuinely interested in her perspective. You've been conducting an affair with my husband during our anniversary trip. What part of this situation troubles you most? Celine was quiet for a moment, apparently not expecting such directness. I didn't plan for any of this to happen, she said finally. Edgar and I have history, yes, but I never intended to interfere with his marriage. How thoughtful of you. Unfortunately, intent and impact are different things, aren't they? Look, Amelia, I understand you're hurt, but Edgar is essentially trapped here because of your actions. Whatever problems exist between you two, surely they can be resolved without involving innocent third parties. The audacity was breathtaking. Innocent third parties? Celine, you've been meeting my husband secretly for a month while I explored Athens alone. You've had dinner with him at restaurants I booked, enjoyed conversations about the real Greece while I followed tourist itineraries designed for couples. In what universe are you an innocent party? Edgar told me your marriage was essentially over, Celine said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. He said you'd grown apart, that you were more like roommates than spouses. Edgar told you what he needed to tell you to justify his behavior, I replied, just like he's probably telling you now that I'm being unreasonable and vindictive, instead of acknowledging that he's experiencing the natural consequences of abandoning his wife for another woman. I could hear voices in the background on Celine's end of the call. Edgar's voice, urgent and insistent. He wants to talk to you, Celine said. I'm sure he does. Amelia, please. Edgar's voice came through the phone, tight with stress. We need to end this standoff. I'll lose the Morrison contract if I don't get home by Monday. Will you? I asked with genuine curiosity. That sounds like a significant professional consequence. Don't pretend you don't care about my career. We built our financial security together over 12 years. You're right, Edgar. We did build something together. And then you decided to risk it all for a month-long affair with your ex-wife. I'm simply allowing you to experience the full weight of that decision. This is about more than just us now, Edgar said, his voice rising. If I lose Morrison, it affects our joint finances, our mortgage, everything we've worked for. I stood up and walked to the edge of my balcony, looking out over the caldera where the setting sun was beginning to paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Edgar, there is no us anymore. There's no our finances or our mortgage. There's just a woman who spent 12 years managing a man's life while he took credit for their shared successes, and that woman has decided to stop. You can't just unilaterally end our marriage. Actually, I can. I've already filed divorce papers with Jared Lintz. You'll receive them officially once you return to Boston and can be properly served. The silence on the other end was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. Amelia, Edgar said finally, his voice small and defeated. What do you want from me? It was the first time in our entire relationship that Edgar had asked what I wanted, instead of assuming I would adapt to his needs. I want you to stop expecting me to solve problems you created, I said. I want you to take responsibility for your choices instead of blaming me for their consequences. And I want you to understand that some decisions can't be undone just because they become inconvenient. So you're going to leave me stranded here indefinitely? I smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. Edgar, I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to stop managing your life and start living my own. The next morning, I was enjoying my final breakfast in Santorini when my phone rang with Edgar's number. This time, however, his tone had shifted from desperation to something approaching anger. Amelia, I've been thinking about this all night, and I realize what you're really doing here. This isn't about hurt feelings or betrayed trust. This is about control. I set down my Greek coffee and looked out over the infinity pool where other hotel guests were beginning their day with swimming in sunshine. Is it? Please, explain my motivations to me. You've always needed to be the one managing everything, making all the decisions, having the final say. The moment I show any independence, any desire to make my own choices, you punish me by withholding the resources I need. I set down my Greek coffee and looked out over the infinity pool where other hotel guests were beginning their day with swimming in sunshine. Is it? Please, explain my motivations to me. You've always needed to be the one managing everything, making all the decisions, having the final say. The moment I show any independence, any desire to make my own choices, you punish me by withholding the resources I need. The accusation was so completely backwards that I felt a laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest. Edgar, let me share something with you that might provide some perspective on your current situation. I opened my laptop and pulled up the detailed financial records I'd been organizing during my week in Santorini. Right now, you're sitting in Athens with access to approximately $200 in cash and whatever Celine is willing to contribute to your daily expenses. Meanwhile, I'm looking at financial statements that paint a rather interesting picture of our 12-year partnership. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that our joint checking account contains $7,847 that I transferred specifically for this trip. I'm talking about our joint savings account with $23,000 that I've contributed to consistently while you've treated it as your personal emergency fund. I'm talking about investment accounts worth $187,000 that exist because I've been managing our finances while you focused on your creative work. Edgar was quiet, but I could hear him breathing heavily through the phone. But here's the really fascinating part, Edgar. Our house, the one you've been so worried about potentially losing, is worth approximately $850,000. And it's in my name alone, inherited from my grandmother and never transferred to joint ownership despite your periodic suggestions that we simplify the paperwork. We always talked about that house as ours. We did talk about it that way, didn't we? Just like we talked about our finances and our travel plans and our social calendar. But when I examine the actual legal documents, a different picture emerges. I clicked through the files Jared Lintz had helped me organize. Your architectural business is registered as a sole proprietorship, which means you're personally liable for all its debts and obligations. If you default on the Morrison contract, which seems likely given that their deadline is Monday and you're currently stranded in Athens, they can pursue damages that would affect your personal assets. Amelia, what are you saying? I'm saying that while you've been rediscovering your authentic self with Celine, I've been rediscovering exactly how much power I actually hold in this relationship. It turns out that the woman you dismissed as overly controlling has been the one controlling access to nearly everything that matters. I pulled up another document on my screen. I've also been in touch with Elena Dillon about listing our house. Did you know the Boston market is particularly strong right now for historic properties in our neighborhood? She thinks we could see offers within the first week. You can't sell our house. Actually, Edgar, I can sell my house, and I think I will. I've been realizing that I don't need 3,000 square feet of space that I've been maintaining primarily for your comfort and entertaining your colleagues. The silence stretched long enough that I continued. I found a beautiful condo in Back Bay that's perfectly sized for one person. Modern kitchen, city views, walking distance to all the cultural attractions you never had time to enjoy with me. This is insane, Edgar said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're destroying our entire life together out of spite. I'm not destroying anything, Edgar. I'm simply stopping the work of maintaining and financing a life you decided you didn't want. I closed my laptop and reached for my phone. Tell me, how is your authentic relationship with Celine progressing? Are you finding the spontaneity and genuine connection you were seeking? Edgar's pause answered the question before his words did. That's not relevant to this conversation. Isn't it? Because from what I can observe, your exciting affair has become rather complicated now that it involves real-world logistics. Celine isn't just your nostalgic escape anymore. She's someone who has to deal with your actual problems and needs. How is she handling that transition? She's been very patient with this situation. Patient? What an interesting choice of words. Not supportive or enthusiastic or excited to build a future together. Patient. I stood up and walked to the balcony railing, looking out over the Aegean Sea that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Edgar, I think you're beginning to understand something important about relationships. The exciting, passionate moments are easy. It's the mundane, practical, everyday support that reveals someone's true commitment. What's your point? My point is that for 12 years, I provided both the excitement and the support, the romance and the practical foundation. You took all of it for granted until another woman offered you a reminder of what the excitement felt like without any of the responsibility. I checked my watch, time to head to the airport for my flight back to Boston, back to my new life as a single woman with complete control over her own resources and decisions. Edgar, I want you to think very carefully about what happens next, because whatever you decide, you'll be managing the consequences entirely on your own. My flight from Santorini to Boston included a layover in Athens, which provided an unexpected opportunity to witness Edgar's deteriorating situation firsthand. As I waited in the International Departure Lounge, scrolling through emails from Elena Dillon about interest in our house listing, I heard a familiar voice raised in frustration at the airline customer service desk. Edgar stood there in wrinkled clothes that looked like they'd been slept in, arguing with a uniformed representative about emergency travel documents. Even from across the terminal, I could see the desperate body language of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. I approached quietly, curious to observe how Edgar handled crisis management when he couldn't delegate the work to someone else. "Sir, I understand your frustration," the airline representative was saying with practiced patience, "but without a valid passport, we cannot issue boarding passes for international travel. The embassy can provide emergency documentation, but that process takes several business days." "You don't understand," Edgar said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I have business meetings on Monday that could cost me my career if I miss them. This is an emergency." "Have you contacted the American Embassy about expedited services?" "Yes, I've contacted them. They want documentation I can't provide because my wife has frozen our accounts. They want proof of identity beyond my driver's license, but every piece of financial documentation is tied to accounts I can't access." The airline representative's expression shifted to polite sympathy mixed with professional detachment. "Sir, marital disputes are unfortunately outside our ability to resolve. I recommend working directly with embassy services or consulting with legal counsel." That's when Edgar spotted me standing 10 feet away, observing his public meltdown with detached interest. His face cycled through surprise, relief, and anger before settling on desperate hope. "Amelia, thank God, please, we need to talk about this rationally." I approached the customer service desk with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent the week spa treatments and sunset dinners while Edgar navigated the consequences of his choices. "Hello, Edgar. You look tired." "I've been sleeping on Celine's couch for a week while trying to sort out this bureaucratic nightmare you've created." "I haven't created anything," I said, addressing both Edgar and the curious airline representative. "I've simply stopped solving problems that aren't my responsibility." The representative looked between us with the expression of someone who'd witnessed many relationship dramas play out at airport counters. "Ma'am, if you have your husband's travel documents, perhaps you could—" "I have our travel documents secured in my possession, yes," I interrupted politely, "but my husband made it clear during our trip that he prefers to handle his own arrangements without my management." Edgar's face flushed red. "Amelia, stop playing games. Give me my passport so I can get home and we can work this out properly." "Work what out, exactly?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You've spent a month conducting an affair with your ex-wife during our anniversary trip. You've told me our marriage feels like existing rather than living. You've criticized my planning and coordination as controlling behavior that prevents you from being your authentic self. What exactly do you think we need to work out?" The airline representative began backing away from what was clearly a personal matter, but I wasn't finished. "Edgar, I'm curious about something. How has Celine been handling your need for practical support? Has she been helping you navigate the embassy requirements, contributing to your accommodation expenses, providing the kind of daily assistance you've grown accustomed to receiving?" Edgar's jaw tightened. "Celine has her own life and career to manage. She can't drop everything to solve my problems." "How inconvenient for you. It must be challenging to discover that exciting, spontaneous relationships don't include complementary life management services." At that moment, my boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. I gathered my carry-on bag and passport holder, the leather portfolio containing both our travel documents that had been the source of so much recent drama. "Amelia, please," Edgar said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know I made mistakes, but don't destroy everything we built together out of revenge." I paused, considering his words carefully. "Edgar, I'm not destroying anything out of revenge. I'm simply stopping the work of maintaining a marriage where only one person was actually committed to making it function." I opened my passport holder and removed Edgar's burgundy booklet, holding it between us like a bridge across an impossible distance. However, I'm not entirely unreasonable. I'll make you a deal. Edgar's eyes fixed on his passport with the intensity of a drowning man spotting a life preserver. I'll give you your passport right now, no strings attached, but I want you to understand exactly what you're choosing. If you take this passport, you're choosing to return to Boston to salvage your business and maintain your professional reputation. You're choosing financial stability and career security over romantic adventure with Celine. Edgar reached for the passport, but I pulled it back slightly. But if you take it, you're also accepting that our marriage is over. No reconciliation discussions, no couples therapy, no attempts to work things out. You're choosing your practical needs over the authentic relationship you claim to want. Edgar stared at the passport, then at me, understanding finally dawning in his expression. Choose, Edgar, the exciting, spontaneous life with Celine or the secure, managed life you can return to in Boston. But you can't have both, and you can't expect me to solve the problems created by whichever choice you make. The boarding announcement repeated, more urgent this time. I had a decision to make as well. Edgar stared at his passport in my hands as if it were a choice between two completely different versions of himself. Around us, the Athens airport bustled with travelers, moving confidently toward their destinations, while he remained frozen between his romantic fantasy and practical reality. "This isn't fair," Edgar said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're forcing me to choose between my career and my personal happiness." "No, Edgar, I'm simply refusing to solve the contradictions in your choices for you. For 12 years, I've been managing the consequences of your decisions so smoothly that you never had to face them directly. Now you're experiencing what accountability actually feels like." The final boarding call for my flight echoed through the terminal. I needed to make my own choice. Hold on to this small piece of power indefinitely, or end this chapter completely and walk away clean. "You know what the most interesting part of this situation is?" I asked, tucking Edgar's passport back into my travel organizer. 3 weeks ago, I would have been devastated to lose you. I would have begged you to choose our marriage, promised to change whatever you found lacking in our relationship, bent myself into whatever shape you needed to feel excited about us again. Edgar looked up sharply, hope flickering in his expression. "But sitting in Santorini for a week, making my own decisions about how to spend my time and money, I realized something profound. I don't want you to choose me, Edgar. I don't want to be chosen over Celine because I'm the safer option or because leaving would be too financially complicated." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen, a photo I'd taken from my hotel balcony that morning, the sunrise painting the caldera in shades of gold and pink. I want to be chosen by someone who sees me as the adventure, not the obstacle to adventure. Someone who views my planning and coordination as expressions of love rather than attempts at control. Someone who understands that maintaining a partnership requires work, but considers that work a privilege rather than a burden. Edgar's face crumpled as the implications of my words settled over him. "So you're not going to give me my passport?" "Actually, I am." I pulled the burgundy booklet from my organizer and held it out to him. "But not because you need it to escape the consequences of your choices, because I need to stop managing your life completely." Edgar reached for the passport with shaking hands, but I didn't release it immediately. "When you get back to Boston, and you will get back because Celine isn't going to support a stranded American indefinitely, you'll find that our house is already under contract. I accepted an offer yesterday morning that's $40,000 over asking price." Edgar's eyes widened. "You can't sell our house without my consent." "I can sell my house with my consent, which is all that's legally required." I finally released the passport, watching Edgar clutch it like a lifeline. "You'll also find that I've moved our joint assets into separate accounts and filed for divorce with terms that protect my individual investments and inherited property." "Amelia, please." "Your business equipment is in boxes in the basement. Your personal belongings are in storage. I've included the facility information in an email I'll send once you're back in the country." Each piece of information hit Edgar like a physical blow. His face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, defeated understanding. "The Morrison contract?" he asked weakly. "According to Harrison Billet, they're willing to renegotiate terms if you can provide revised timelines by Wednesday. You'll need to work directly with them. I've removed myself from all business communications. I shouldered my carry-on bag and looked at Edgar one final time. This man who'd shared my bed for 12 years, who I'd loved and supported and organized my entire adult life around, now seemed like a stranger wearing a familiar face. Edgar, I want you to understand something important. This isn't punishment for your affair with Celine, though that certainly clarified some things for me. This is me finally accepting that you were right about one thing. We had grown apart. But not because I was too controlling or because you needed more spontaneity. I paused, gathering my thoughts for what would likely be our final conversation as married people. We grew apart because you stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a service provider. You wanted the benefits of being married to someone who managed your comfort and security while reserving the right to seek excitement and validation elsewhere. That's not a marriage, Edgar. That's an employment arrangement with unpaid labor. Edgar opened his mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. Go back to Boston. Rebuild your business. Figure out whether what you have with Celine can survive the reality of shared rent payments and grocery shopping and whose turn it is to clean the bathroom. Learn whether romantic nostalgia can sustain a relationship when it's tested by everyday responsibilities. I turned toward my boarding gate, then looked back one final time. And Edgar, next time you fall in love, try choosing someone who makes you want to be a better partner, rather than someone who makes you want to escape from partnership entirely. As I walked toward my gate, leaving Edgar standing in the departure lounge with his recovered passport and his uncertain future, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the unknown. For the first time in over a decade, I had no idea what tomorrow would bring, and I couldn't wait to find out. The flight from Athens to Boston gave me 10 hours to process the magnitude of what I just accomplished. As the plane lifted off from Greek soil, I watched Edgar's ancient playground disappear beneath the clouds and felt something profound settle in my chest. Not relief exactly, but a deep sense of completion. For the first time in our marriage, I'd allowed Edgar to experience the full weight of his choices without rushing to cushion the impact. I spent the flight reviewing emails that painted a clear picture of Edgar's rapidly deteriorating situation. Harrison Billett had forwarded messages from Morrison Resort Group expressing serious concerns about Edgar's absence and requesting immediate clarification about project timelines. Elena Dillon sent photos of the line of prospective buyers viewing our house, with 3 backup offers already submitted in case the primary buyer encountered financing issues. Most telling, however, were the messages I'd received from mutual friends who'd been following Edgar's social media presence. His carefully curated posts about exploring authentic Greek culture had abruptly stopped a week ago, replaced by radio silence that people were beginning to notice. "Hey, Amelia," read a text from my college roommate Kendall. "Saw Edgar's posts from Greece, but haven't seen you in any recent photos. Everything okay? You're usually the one documenting all your adventures together." I found myself crafting a response that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Edgar and I are exploring different paths right now. I'm doing wonderfully. By the time we landed at Logan Airport, I had 17 missed calls from Edgar and a series of increasingly frantic text messages documenting his attempt to navigate international travel alone for the first time in over a decade. "The airline is demanding payment for a new ticket since I missed my original flight. Our joint credit card was declined. I'm at the Athens airport but can't figure out how to change my ticket to an earlier flight. The kiosks aren't working and the lines are insane. Finally got rebooked but had to pay with Celine's credit card. She's not happy about fronting $1,200 for my ticket. Landing in Boston at 11 p.m. Can you pick me up? I don't have cash for a taxi, and Uber requires a card that isn't frozen." That last message arrived as my own plane was taxiing to our gate. I read it while gathering my carry-on bag, noting how quickly Edgar's tone had shifted from anger to practical desperation. Within hours of regaining his passport, he'd discovered that having the legal right to travel and having the resources to travel comfortably were entirely different things. I took the T home from Logan, a 40-minute journey that gave me time to savor the delicious irony of Edgar's situation. The man who'd criticized my planning and coordination was now stranded at Boston's airport because he'd never learned to navigate travel logistics without my support. My phone buzzed with another message. "Amelia, I know you're angry, but I need help getting home. I can pay you back once I sort out the account situation." I typed and deleted several responses before settling on, "Edgar, there are taxis, ride shares, and public transportation available at Logan Airport. I'm confident you'll figure something out." When I finally reached our house, my house, I corrected myself, I was startled by how different it felt walking through rooms that no longer contained Edgar's presence. The real estate staging team had worked efficiently during my absence, removing personal photos and clutter to create spaces that looked like possibilities rather than memories. I poured a glass of wine and sat in the living room that had hosted so many dinner parties where I'd coordinated every detail to showcase Edgar's professional success. Tomorrow, strangers would walk through these rooms imagining their own futures here, and by next month, I'll be living somewhere completely new. My phone rang at midnight, Edgar calling from what sounded like the back of a taxi, traffic noise and radio chatter audible in the background. "I'm almost home," he said without preamble. "We need to talk about this house situation. Elena Dillon said you've already accepted an offer?" "I have. Closing is scheduled for the end of the month." "Amelia, you can't just sell our home without discussing it with me first." I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the garden I'd maintained for 12 years, the herbs and flowers I'd planted to complement the meals I'd cooked for Edgar's colleagues and clients. "Edgar, this house stopped being our home the moment you decided our marriage was something you needed to escape from. Now it's my asset to dispose of as I see fit. Where am I supposed to live?" The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the fundamental difference in how we'd approached our separation. Edgar had spent a month focused on his romantic adventure with Celine without considering practical consequences. I'd spent a week systematically dismantling our shared infrastructure and building a foundation for my independent future. "I assume you'll figure something out," I said, echoing his own approach to problem solving. "You're an intelligent man with professional skills and income potential. I'm sure you'll manage." The taxi pulled into our driveway, headlights sweeping across the windows of the house that would soon belong to someone else. I watched Edgar climb out, looking rumpled and defeated as he stood on the sidewalk staring at the sold sign Elena had placed that morning. "The locks have been changed," I said into the phone, still watching him through the window. "Your belongings are in storage unit 247 at Boston Self Storage on Morrissey Boulevard. The rental is paid through the end of next month." Edgar looked up at the house, then at his phone, understanding finally dawning on his face. "Amelia," he said, his voice small and tired, "what have you done?" "Edgar," I replied, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. "I've set us both free." 6 months later, I was sitting in my new Back Bay condo, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the public garden I'd always admired but never had time to enjoy when I was managing Edgar's schedule. My phone buzzed with a text from Kendall. "Lunch tomorrow? I want to hear about your latest consulting project." The consulting work had materialized almost immediately after word spread about my divorce. Apparently, my reputation for flawless event coordination and financial management had impressed more people than I'd realized. Within weeks of returning from Greece, I had 3 clients asking me to help organize their own major life transitions: 1 divorce, 1 estate sale, and 1 international relocation that required exactly the kind of meticulous planning Edgar had dismissed as controlling behavior. I just confirmed my lunch plans when another message arrived from an unexpected source. "Edgar. Amelia, I hope you're well. I wanted you to know that Celine and I have decided to go our separate ways. You were right about some things. I'm sorry for how everything ended between us." I read the message twice, noting its careful neutrality. No requests for reconciliation, no attempts to shift blame, no demands for my attention or assistance. Just a simple acknowledgement and apology. According to mutual friends, Edgar's return to Boston had been more challenging than his Greek adventure. He'd lost the Morrison contract, struggled to find affordable housing without my credit history supporting his applications, and discovered that maintaining a household required skills he'd never developed during our marriage. The romantic reunion with Celine had apparently lasted exactly as long as it took her to realize that Edgar's charm was more compelling when it wasn't accompanied by requests for financial support and visa assistance. But the most interesting development had been Edgar's gradual recognition of how much unpaid labor I'd contributed to our partnership. Cooking, cleaning, social coordination, financial management, travel planning, gift shopping, appointment scheduling, tasks he'd barely noticed when they were seamlessly handled had become overwhelming obstacles when they became his sole responsibility. I crafted a brief response. "I'm glad you're figuring things out, Edgar. I hope you find what you're looking for." What I didn't tell him was that I'd already found what I was looking for, in the most unexpected place. 3 weeks ago, while consulting on a client's estate sale in Cambridge, I'd met Carter Billett, Harrison's nephew, recently divorced himself and navigating his own major life transition. Our first conversation had lasted 4 hours, covering everything from travel dreams to career ambitions to the profound relief of making decisions based solely on personal preferences rather than complex negotiations with an unappreciative partner. Carter understood something Edgar never had, that planning and coordination weren't attempts at control, but expressions of care and investment in shared experiences. When I mentioned wanting to return to Greece to explore islands I'd missed during my solo Santorini week, Carter's immediate response was, "That sounds incredible. What would you want to see there?" Not what he wanted to do, or how my ideas might inconvenience his preferences, but genuine curiosity about my vision for the trip. This morning, I'd booked flights for both of us to Athens, scheduled for next month. But this time, I was planning an adventure with someone who saw my organizational skills as an asset rather than a burden, someone who contributed ideas rather than criticism, someone who understood that the best spontaneous moments often arose from a foundation of thoughtful preparation. Edgar had been right about one thing: Greece was good for the soul. He'd just been wrong about which soul needed saving and what kind of salvation it required. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything you never knew you wanted.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.